So hi everyone, welcome back. If you've joined after our last session, or welcome if you went before. We'll just have a few minutes where everyone comes in, and then we'll start properly once we've got most people already in the webinar. Okay, there's people still coming in, but I think we'll kind of do the housekeeping and things while the last few people are coming in as well. So welcome to, I think, the final session for today, and I think the final session for the MyTutor half-term sessions for GCSE Biology. So this week we've been looking at inheritance, genetics and variation, and this is the last session, and we're going to look at some exam technique. My name's Charlotte. There we go. I studied conservation and biodiversity at the University of Exeter as a master's degree. Before that, I did a degree in biological sciences with study abroad, also at the University of Exeter. And I now work for a charity called the Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group, helping farmers do good things for biodiversity and the planet. A few of you might recognise me because I did do the biology GCSE sessions for the summer school that we ran over lockdown. And although Olivia was originally teaching the first part of this half-term course, she unfortunately was taken ill, and so I've just come in to take these last couple of sessions. Yes, this is the last lesson, Pranav, and hello, I recognise your name from the summer school, so I hope you're enjoying these as well and finding them useful. Okay, so let's leave off this today. Let's move. There we go. Okay, let's move on to today's content. So we're finishing up inheritance, genetics, and variation today. And as I said, we're going to go through some of the types of questions that you might get as part of your exam, and we're going to talk about the best ways to answer them when you're under exam conditions. So hopefully this will help those of you that perhaps get a little bit stressed, or those of you that find it difficult to kind of read the question the first time, and you get a bit worried and write too much or too little. We're going to talk about all of those today. A little bit of housekeeping. So you have a Q&A and a chat button. Any questions about content, any questions about exam technique, best revision techniques, university, if you want to talk about that, A-levels, anything, pop them in the Q&A, and then anything that's kind of replying to questions that I ask and things like that, pop that in the chat. Okay, so because we are revising inheritance, genetics and variation this week, I thought it would be good to start with a bit of a Slido and look at keywords, because keywords are one of the best things to get memorized to do well in exams. Keywords are what gets you points for different topics, so it's well worth being familiar with the keywords that that are used in each topic. So I've got this Slido. I'm just going to turn it on and then present it, and then it will come up with instructions on the screen in a second. Okay, so we've got this this Slido here. So if you go to slido.com or you scan that QR code on your phone, you might have to use that number, #H2315. And what that allows you to do is to put in some of the keywords that you've learned for the topic of inheritance, genetics and variation, and it will make this really cool word pattern on there. So if you were in some of the biology lessons over the summer, we did this quite a lot as a way of kind of revising. Okay, good. We've got a few coming in now. There's probably a few more people logging in and things. So mutation, genotype and phenotype, big ones. Loads of people are writing those down. That's really good. Evolution, meiosis, allele, gene, species, DNA, environment, good. Mitosis, heterozygous, yes. Natural selection, haploid, homozygous, recessive. Yeah, this is really good. All the stuff that you've learned this week, all of those keywords, pop them down here. We'll get a really good idea of what we think are the most important words as part of this topic. Ribosomes, yes, really good. Kingdom, oh good, yeah, you could list all of those things that we learned earlier today. Kingdom, phylum, order, class, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. That's terrible, isn't it? I don't quite know that off by heart. You should know off by heart, for example. Dominant meiosis, oh my word. I think we've nearly broken it. We've filled it up. DNA, phenotype, cystic fibrosis, good. That's a really good case study to use there. Characteristics in there as well. Cells, phylum, family, yeah. Allele in there. Oh, Olivia coming up pretty high in there, yeah. Might not help you so much in your exam. Good. Asexual reproduction versus sexual reproduction. Yeah. Putting Olivia at the centre there. Well, she's done a fab job. You guys have obviously remembered loads about genetics. Gamete, mRNA. Well done, everyone. Polydactyl is in there as well. Yeah. Fab. Okay. So a really good selection of keywords there that hopefully we've reminded, oh, MRSA in there, yeah. So hopefully we've reminded ourselves of those. And then when we go on to do the rest of the questions that we've got planned for today, then hopefully we can use those to try and get those points. Okay, I'm going to stop that poll there. Really good. Glad that that worked well. Okay, so let's move on to today's content, or the second content of today. So the first types of questions that I thought we'd talk about are the simple questions. And we call them simple because normally you don't have to write too much to answer them, but they are very rarely simple in their content. So I've started with a genetics one. Excuse the small writing there. I hope that's okay. If anyone's having problems reading it, let me know and I will zoom in. So we've got a question at the top here. So humans have 2 different sex chromosomes, X and Y, and figure 2 shows the inheritance of sex in humans. Oh, you did this one with Olivia. Good, you'll know the answer. So when we're talking about exam technique, one of the things I always suggest is underlining keywords. So if we were going to approach this question in an exam, take a pencil in with you, a coloured pencil if you're allowed it. I usually use a red one, and I underline the keywords. So we know we're talking about humans here, keyword, and we know we're talking about sex chromosomes, X and Y. You'll probably know that X and Y are key components of sex chromosomes. So if you saw X and Y as letters, you generally know that you're talking about sex chromosomes. Inheritance of sex in humans. And then we look at the figure. When we're approaching a figure, we always look at it, make sure we understand what the axes are and the pattern that's being shown. Now, this isn't a graph, but it's still a figure. So we know that we've got the father here and mother on the top. X and X, and then X and Y, and they filled in the gaps there. Circle a part of figure 2 that shows an egg cell. Okay. notice that I have underlined the word circle here because that's the instruction. Now this seems stupid, you know that that's what it is. That's fine. And yes, those of you who are answering the chat, do answer in the chat if you want to, feel free. That's a good way of practicing your technique. Let's go for it. Good. Loads of people getting that one. For 1 mark there, so you only have to do one thing. It's pretty obvious in this one, circle. And yes, exactly. So XX shows an egg cell. Well done. Then the next one, oh no, let's not move that around. The next one, give the genotype of male offspring. Again, this is a 1 mark question. It's relatively simple. You've probably thought of the answer already. Genotype of the male offspring. Those are the key words. Genotype of the male offspring. And yes, the answer there is XY. Males always have a Y chromosome. Okay, I'm just going to pan it up a little bit so we can say the next bit. A man and a woman have 2 sons. 2 is a key word there. The woman is pregnant with a 3rd child. What is the chance? Chance is a key word there that this child will also be a boy. Okay, so keywords there are chance, that gives us some indication that they want probability and that it will be a boy, so male. Tick 1 box. They've already put the 1 there in bold. You can underline that one as well. Good, loads of people answering this quickly. Okay, so you can use your Punnett Square for this if you're not sure. Oops, here we go. So here's your Punnett Square, and you can see in there that 2 out of the 4 options are for XY, which is what we know means male. So 50% chance, or half, that the child will also be a boy. And yes, there's a couple of people rightly pointing out in the chat that it doesn't matter how many boys you've had before, the chance is always 50%. So remember, each child is individual. The probability doesn't change depending on how many children you've had before the latest child. It will always be 50%. Okay. So another one here. This one is a fill in the sentences. And even with these, it's really easy to think, right, these are really easy questions, I know the answer, but make sure you take the time to read it, because there's nothing worse than giving away the easy points. You will need these. So make sure that you underline the keywords, get these ones right, you know them, so it's worth doing it properly. So egg cells and sperm cells, okay, so gametes, each contain the structures given in the box. List these 3 structures in size order, starting with the smallest. Okay, classic mistake at a question like this would be starting with the biggest. So make sure that you just get that reading right and really accurate. Okay, I'm going to test my typing skills now. Starting with the smallest. Okay, so the smallest is gene, then chromosome, then nucleus. This probably won't quite fit, even if it doesn't quite sit on the lines there, but you get the idea. Okay. The egg and the sperm contain genetic material. Okay, we know that. Draw a ring around the correct answer to complete the sentence. The genetic material is made of. Need more answers. Well done to all of those that have got the nucleus, gene, chromosome the right way around. Gene, chromosome. actually, there are a fair few of you that are putting nucleus chromosome gene there. So it is well worth just reading the question properly there. You should be starting with the smallest. Okay, answer to this one. Draw a ring around the correct answer to complete the sentence. The genetic material is made of DNA. The correct answer there. So we draw a ring around DNA. Well done, everyone. So remember, genetic material is made up of chromosomes, which contain genes, which contain nucleotides. We can carry on through that. Okay, so that's simple questions. Simple questions, very short questions. You can also have questions that involve drawing lines between them, that involve filling in tables. They tend to be like the one-word questions. And as I said, the thing to watch out for with those simple questions is making sure that you get those simple marks. So for most of us, those are the questions that are more likely to know the answer, and they're a bit of a confidence boost because you look at them and think, oh, you know, I know that XY is the male genotype. And that's great because, you know, you're showing you know that knowledge, but it's really important to make sure that you don't make those silly mistakes. So that's where you can pick up those 1 or 2 extra points, and they may well be the difference between one grade and another. So it's worth, you know, worth doing that, reading it properly. And the reason I suggest underlining is that underlining makes you read them properly. And when I'm working with students, we usually do them, and I will make my student underline the keywords and tell me what they're thinking as they do it, what they think the keywords are, because it just gets you in the habit of doing that. And it's really slow when you're in a lesson with me and you're explaining all of your thinking, and you know that the XY is the male genotype there, but it's well worth doing because it gets you in practice, and then when it comes to the exam, it's second nature. Okay, so now we're going to talk about questions with graphs. And again, graphs are really easy to misread, so we do some more underlining. When you've got a little bit of text at the top here, it's well worth reading that properly, underlining the keywords, making sure you've done that, and do that before you even look at the graph or the question. So go into it kind of with an open mind, if you see what I mean. So the graph shows the estimated brain volume. Okay, so that's one thing that they're measuring, of different species of humans. Lots of keywords there. It also shows the time when the different species existed on Earth, so time of existence. The data is plotted for modern humans and for 3 types of extinct ancestors of humans. Okay, so there's quite a lot on this graph, even before we've looked at the graph itself. So let's move down to the graph. And again, I would really recommend before you even look at the questions that we look at the graph, and that's why I haven't put any questions about this graph on this slide. So we are going to have a proper look at this, and before we get any look at the questions, we're going to make sure that we know exactly what this graph shows. So first thing with graph is the axes. So our x-axis runs along the bottom. And we look at our axes and we always look at the units and the numbers, I suppose. But we look at the name of the unit. So this is in millions of years ago, and it runs from 4 million years ago to 0. That was worth looking at because normally we would have 0 at this end of an axis. But because this is time, they've chosen to go from 4 million years ago to 0, which would be present day. Well, we can underline this if it would be helpful, and perhaps put a little arrow just saying, you know, don't misread this, because if you're reading along this axis, you need to be reading from right to left rather than left to right. Okay, so we've established that. So let's look at the y-axis. Y-axis is estimated brain volume. in centimeters cubed. So good, they've got a unit there as well. Remember that it's centimeters cubed. They might ask you to do a little calculation and you need to know whether you need to convert it or not. If they ask you for meters cubed rather than centimeters cubed, you need to know, do that conversion. And we know that it's estimated as well. Maybe put a little dot by that just to remind you that it's estimated and not actual brain volume. And this runs from 0 to 2000 and it goes up in 400s there, centimeters cubed. Okay, so that's our axes. Now let's look at the pattern on the graph itself. So we've got this line, and for those of you that are maths minded, you're immediately thinking positive correlation. This is really good. As one goes up, the other goes up. Don't forget the x-axis runs backwards. So as millions of years ago gets smaller, estimated brain volume in centimeters cubed gets bigger. Make sure you're sure of that. You might well be asked what the graph shows. Okay, let's look at all these dots. So we know that there are modern humans on here. I said that in the top, and we've got lots and lots of dots there for modern humans, all clustered at the top there. And then we've got these other species, so Homo erectus, Homo habilis, and Australopithecus afarensis. Hassan, that's a really good question about whether it would be a negative correlation. I think you could, it depends how you word it, and that's why this question is really important. It's really important to word it properly. So there is a positive correlation between the decreasing millions of years and estimated brain volume. Australopithecus is the name of the last one. Put out there. Afarensis. Okay, right, we've got this graph sorted. We found this weird axis and we know what it shows. Basically, we have a big brain volume than any of these guys that came before us over the millions of years. So here's the questions. I've kept the graph up there. It's quite difficult to fit it all on one slide. So these ones are short answer questions. So we need to write sentences for these. And the number of sentences that you write, I generally say that you should match your sentences to the number of marks. That's not always completely right, but it's a good ballpark figure and it's something to aim for if you're someone that writes a lot. You know, you probably only need the same number of sentences as there are marks. So these are all 1 mark questions going down here. Feel free to answer them in the chat if you want to practice your technique. We'll have the answers on the next slide. So as humans evolved, their brain volume changed. Okay, we kind of know that already, but good to read it. What has happened to human brain volume over the past 4 million years? Okay, well, we've had a good look at our graph and we knew that before we read the question. So that's good. We've already got an answer to that one. Part 2, why is the evidence for estimated brain volume for Homo sapiens stronger than the evidence for Australopithecus afarensis? Okay, right. So we might need to have a look back at our graph for that one, remind ourselves who Homo sapiens are and Australopithecus afarensis there at the bottom. And remember the command word there is why. So you need to give a reason for that difference. In a book, the brain volume of a different species, Australopithecus africanus, is stated to be about 600 centimeters cubed. Okay, so that would be about here. That's the first thing I'm thinking. You need to know roughly where that brain volume is. Use evidence from the graphic above. Okay, it's to the side here, but it would be above in your exam. Now that's a key phrase there. You need to use numbers from the graph in this question to estimate when Australopithecus africanus lived on Earth. Okay. Good, I can see loads of good answers in the chat. There's also some really interesting points as well. So let's pull up the answers. Okay, so I've written that top one. What's happened to human brain volume over the past 4 million years? Human brain volume increases with time. Now, actually, looking at that now, I've written that. But because of that backwards axis, that's possibly slightly, you would get the point for saying that the brain volume increases. That's what they're looking for. 1 point for that word increases. But actually, it's probably best to just leave it as increases, because with time there implies that as time increases, and obviously that axis mucks that about a bit. So if you're going to be really pernickety about that answer, you'd say that you'd be better off just leaving it as brain volume increases. Okay, why is the evidence for estimated brain volume of Homo sapiens stronger than the evidence for Australopithecus afarensis? So here I've copied and pasted something from the mark schemes. I think it's really good for you guys to see the mark schemes, and then you can see exactly what your examiners are looking at when they mark your answers. So they're looking at, there is more evidence /specimen/results for Homo sapiens. When there's a slash in the mark scheme, it means you can use any of those words. So evidence, specimens, or results is fine. Then they've got some notes. Allow examples of this, e.g. more/better fossils. Allow converse if clearly referring to Australopithecus. So you could say that there's less evidence for Australopithecus rather than more evidence for Homo sapiens. And ignore reference to being more recent. Okay. Now that last one can be a bit of a trip up, and actually a couple of you in the chat have put that word, more recent. So here you need to think slightly about, you know, your statistical work and your scientific technique. You have more evidence for Homo sapiens, and therefore the more evidence that you have, the more samples that you have, the more accurate your results. So you have stronger evidence. There's only 3 of Australopithecus afarensis down there, whereas there's, I can't even count those, they're a bit small, but there's a lot more of them. And then finally, and most of you got this one in a book, the brain volume of a different species is about 600 centimeters cubed. All you needed to do for this was to draw a line across at about 600. So this is asking whether you've read the axes properly. So if we look at 600, it'll be about halfway between 400 and 800, because remember we're going up in 200 in increments of 400. And from that, you can draw a line, and in an exam, use a ruler, make sure that line is straight and that you haven't dipped down like my arrow has here. And then you can read off where you get to on the x-axis when the y-axis is at 600. And in this case, that would be 2.5 to 3.5 million years ago. And accept any number in that range. So they've given you quite a good range there to get that 1 mark. Okay, really good. Little question there. Does having a larger brain volume always mean that we're smarter? It depends what you mean by smarter, I suppose. Having a larger brain volume means that you can do more processes. I suppose that's one way of describing it. You're able to do much more with your brain. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're smarter in a way. And also, it depends. I mean, Australopithecus afarensis probably had a much, much smaller brain than Homo sapiens do now. Whereas within Homo sapiens, and Einstein was a Homo sapien, you're saying that you've heard that Einstein had a relatively small brain. But within Homo sapiens, how much difference does that relatively small change in brain size make to intelligence? Something to think about. Okay, so that's questions with graphs. Now we're moving on to short answer questions again. So these are short answer questions, but I've tried to pick kind of 2 or 3 markers here. So this is where your sentences come in. Before we had, 1 mark questions. Okay, so here I've used an example that we kind of talked about yesterday, I think, the peppered moth. And before we get to the question, we're going to have a good look at the text and, in this case, the photos. So the photographs show 2 forms of peppered moth. Okay, so 2 forms is the keyword there, and we know that we're talking about peppered moths on tree bark. So they've done a pretty good job here of showing both forms of the moth on white and dark surfaces. So we have the dark form of the moth there on a tree bark covered with lichens. And then we've got a dark form of the moth there and a pale form on a tree bark made black by, and that word pollution is supposed to be under there as well. So we're looking at that and we're thinking, the peppered moth, you can see the 2 types clearly there, and they look very different compared to whether they're on lichen or on bark made black by pollution. So if we scroll down slightly, in the 19th century, pollution made the bark of many trees go black. That's basically, there was lots of industrial processes, we were burning a lot of coal, and there was a lot of black smoke. So it made the bark, lots of trees go black. Explain why. Explain, keyword there. So this is slightly more than a simple question. This is asking you to explain something, so give reasons. The population of the pale form of the moth in forests decreased, and the population of the dark form of the moth in forests increased. So underline those, make sure that you're clear that it's the pale form that decreased and the dark form that increased. 3 marks for this question. So going by the rule of thumb, you need to use roughly 3 sentences, 3 short sentences to answer this one. Again, you might be able to do it in less if you've got some keywords, but if you're one of those people that writes a lot, aim for 3 short sentences. So answering this in the chat might take a bit more time because you've got to write a little bit more. But you're welcome to put some ideas in there if you want, and then I will pop the answers up in a second. So what I've done for this one, again, I've pulled up on the next slide, I have pulled up an example of the mark scheme so that you can get a good look at what a mark scheme looks like. And remember as well that the examiner or whoever's marking your test is looking at that mark scheme, trying to work to that. And they're also trying to read your writing. So well worth just making sure that you've set out your answer clearly. Or typed your answer clearly if you're using a computer. So here is the answer outlined in red there. So as quite a lot of you have said, there's some really good answers coming through in the chat. Well done, all of you. Really good ideas, and most of you are right on the money there. So the pale form is now more easily seen by predators, or you could say that the dark form is now less easily seen by predators. So they'll accept both ways round of seeing it, which makes sense. And they'll accept a reference to camouflage, which is good. Quite a few of you have put the word camouflage in your answers in the chat. So that's really good. So you'd get 1 mark for that. So you get 1 mark for talking about how the moth is seen or camouflaged. Then you need to take that 1 step further, because remember, this is an explanation. So is a really good word to use when you're explaining things. So the pale form is more likely to be eaten, or the dark form is less likely to be eaten. So the dark form is more likely to breed or pass on its genes, or the pale form is less likely to breed or pass on its genes. So this is linking to natural selection there. And you just need to be careful to make sure that you explain your answer fully. So it seems obvious, doesn't it, that if it's not as well camouflaged, it's more likely to be eaten. But you just need to make that point. So always ask yourself why. I remember one of my students, whenever we talked about a question, so here perhaps I would have said, I don't know, this is a good example actually. So why did the population of the pale form of the moth decrease? And she always used to say, well, they all died. And I thought, yeah, that's true. But you need to ask yourself why. So why did they all die? Why was that a problem? And then you need to write down a sentence for each of those explaining. Yeah, good point there. From someone in the chat there, sorry, I can't quite see who it is. Saying that therefore which meant so, hereafter, and then are all really good words for joining your sentences together or parts of sentences together there. Yeah, exactly. So, therefore, which meant, hereafter, and then. Really good for joining your sentences together. Okay. So a really good example there of a short answer question. 3 marks for that one. Okay. So here we've got a question about fossils. And I put the questions up straight away here because I want us to train ourselves to always look at the photos first and the text first. So make sure you've read this little blurb here at the beginning of the question first. So here the photograph shows a fossil footprint. The fossil was found in a rock at the bottom of a shallow river. So I'm underlining there words that jump out at me because I'm thinking about when I learned about fossils with Charlotte yesterday. And she said, oh, some of the fossils form in rock, and it might matter that it was at the bottom of a shallow river. And it's a footprint, so it's not the skeleton, it's a footprint. Scientists believe this is a footprint of a dinosaur. So again, they've taken care there to say that scientists believe it. The dinosaur was alive 110 million years ago. Okay, so then we've got 4 parts of this question. We've got a suggest question. Suggest how the fossil shown in the photograph was formed. How it was formed. Part 2. Fossils may also be formed by other methods. Describe, let's describe, question 1, other method of forming a fossil. And then part B, dinosaurs are now extinct. Give 2 factors that can cause extinction. And pay attention to these words because just occasionally here they've given you 2 numbers there. So 2 factors, they've given you a 1 and a 2. But they might not do that. And then you need to make sure that you mention 2 factors rather than just putting 1 down and misreading the question slide. And then a how question. How can fossils give evidence for evolution? How questions are kind of similar to explain questions, aren't they? Explain how fossils give evidence for evolution. Except this is a 1 marker, so we don't need a detailed explanation or anything. So here, looking at these marks, we've got 1, 1, 2, 1. So they're all looking for 1 specific thing, apart from part B there, where it says 2 factors. So 1 for each mark. Okay, good. Loads of people putting really good answers in the chat. Well done. Ooh, good question from Het. How did they figure out how long the dinosaur was alive? That's a really good question. So most of the time they do it from the rock that it's in. So when rock forms, it forms in layers. And from that rock, you can roughly tell how far back it was because, you know, basically geologists know when each type of rock was likely to form from the tectonic activity and the climate activity at the time. And you can also use something called carbon dating. Yeah, a few people have said that in there. So carbon dating can be used, which basically measures So certain compounds break down at certain rates, and when you know what's called the half-life of a compound, which we do for certain carbon compounds, then you can tell how many half-lives you need to measure to get back that far. It's a bit more complicated than that. That's a very basic explanation. Okay. Good, loads of good ideas in the chat there. Okay, so I've pasted in here a couple of them. The rest are on the next slide. So part A, part 1, in the mark scheme, they've said, suggest how the fossil shown in the photograph is formed. Animal walking on soft material or suitably named material. So remember we underlined shallow river there. So that comes into play straight away in this A part 1, because shallow river was supposed to give us a bit of a hint that the bottom of it might be shallow enough to walk in and therefore quite muddy. So they might leave a trace in the bottom there. Or further detail, e.g. dries out, buried, hardens, or turns to rock. So a pretty wide set of phrases would be acceptable for that question there. It does have a note that says do not allow general descriptions of how fossils are formed or reference to bones not decaying. So there's no bones involved in a footprint, and you need to make sure that you reference that footprint. This is a trace of an animal. It isn't part of an animal. Fossils may be formed by other methods, and you could have any one from this list here. They've given you quite a wide selection to choose from there. So from bones, shells, hard parts, or from parts that do not decay, you can mention that one. They have to ignore any mentions of imprint or impression. That's because that's exactly what a footprint is. Wonky line there. You can also have that the animal is trapped in resin or amber or ice or peat. We've talked briefly about that yesterday, that whole animals can sometimes be trapped in ice, amber, peat, or resin, and therefore be preserved whole. And then infiltration with minerals as well, they'll allow there, because it is the mineralization of those hard parts that's what creates the fossil skeletons and things. Okay, the second part. What slide were we on? Whoops. There we go. So it mentioned give 2 factors that can cause extinction. So you can have any 2 from a whole long list here, which gives you quite a lot of confidence, doesn't it? So examples of physical factors that cause extinction would be flooding, volcanic activity, asteroid collision, drought, ice age, or temperature change would all be in there, all of which are things that we think about when we think of even the film Ice Age. Is a really good way of revising that particular part of the topic. Examples of biological factors such as predators, disease, competition. A few of you did say competition. I saw competition for food or mates, cyclical nature of speciation. That one's quite a complicated one, but you can put that one if speciation is your thing. Isolation or lack of habitat or habitat change. Any of those would have been accepted. And it's good that they've allowed you to have the physical factors and the biological factors, and just be aware that sometimes they may ask for one or the other. Okay, and the last part, how can fossils give evidence for evolution? So older fossils are simpler, or there's a change with time. So what they're getting at there is that fossils show changes in organisms over time. Be careful there, because they've said ignore the word evolve. That's quite interesting. So just be quite precise with your answers here. How can fossils give evidence for evolution? You can't say the word evolve, because evolution is in the question. Okay, longer answer questions. Sticking with the theme of evolution here. So, look at this diagram. In the 1800s, Darwin and Lamarck had different theories about how the long nose of Phiomia evolved into the trunk of the African elephant. So we know we're looking at the trunk here, that's the main thing. The question that I've picked up on for 4 marks is use Darwin's theory of natural selection. Okay, that's a pretty clear instruction. So use the theory of natural selection to explain. So they're looking for an explanation. How the elephant's trunk evolved. So this is 4 marks, 4 short sentences. You need to make 4 points. Now I'm well aware that 4 short sentences, so sometimes you could have 2 sentences with 2 parts joined together, but you need to make 4 points one way or another. And for all of these theory of natural selection questions, there are 4 particular points that you need to make. So this one's well worth changing, well worth looking for. So there's a variation in mutation there for 1 mark. Therefore, a longer-nosed individual gets more food or leaves for another mark. Those survivors breed more, the 3rd mark, and then they pass on genes or alleles or DNA for that characteristic, which is the long nose. 4 marks there, you can include them in almost every question about natural selection. Okay, so well worth learning those. Practice that question again and again. Good question there. What website is this from? So I get these questions from Physics and Maths Tutor, because then you can pick questions by topic. Okay, and then we've got one more example there of a long answer question. This particular long answer question is worth 4 marks, but you quite often get questions like this that are worth more. Sometimes they're worth 6 marks or 5. They've given you a blurb, so it's well worth reading that and underlining the keywords. So insects can be both useful and harmful to crop plants. Insects such as bees pollinate the flowers of some crop plants, and pollination is needed for successful sexual reproduction of crop plants. Some insects eat crops and other insects eat the insects that eat crops. Gosh, that's a sentence. Some insects eat crops and other insects eat the insects that eat crops. So they're making the point there that insects can be a predator of crops or of the crop predators. Corn borers are insects that eat maize plants, so they're an example of crop predator. A toxin produced by the bacterium Bacillus thuringiensis kills insects. Scientists grow Bacillus thuringiensis in large containers, and the toxin is collected from the containers and is sprayed over maize crops to kill corn borers. So this is quite a complicated explanation. We do need to read this properly and get a good idea about what Bacillus thuringiensis is, what a corn borer is, and what that toxin does. So a company has developed genetically modified maize plants. GM maize plants contain a gene from Bacillus thuringiensis, and this gene changes the GM maize plants so that they produce the toxin. Okay, the question is, would you advise farmers to grow GM maize plants? Notice they're asking for your opinion here. Justify your answer by giving advantages and disadvantages of growing GM maize plants. Use the information from the box and your own knowledge to help you. Okay, so for this question, 4 marks, you need to give your opinion, you need to give advantages and disadvantages, and you need to use information from the box and your own knowledge. 4 things, 4 marks. So here is what it says on the mark scheme. And notice that on the mark scheme, there's a really long explanation for what they can allow you marks for on here, which is quite comforting really, because you know they're really allowing you to have as many points as they possibly can. So you can have any 4 from this really long list. So you can have a justification based on comparison of the relative merits of at least one advantage and one disadvantage. So they give you a mark just for providing an opinion based on advantages and disadvantages. So it doesn't matter what that opinion is or what those advantages and disadvantages are, you get that mark for just structuring your question that way. You can have any of these advantages: less effort for the farmer, pesticide is always there, less insects to eat the maize, and greater crop production or yield, and any of the disadvantages. So the toxin kills other insects, so some crops don't get pollinated, possible harm when eaten by humans, damage to food chains is another possibility, and the gene may spread to other species. Lots to go on there, and all you needed to do to get the full marks was to provide your opinion given advantages and disadvantages of that GM crop. So I put together a worked answer for you. So typically I've done this in 2 sentences, but I have made 4 points. So I would advise farmers to grow GM crops, given my opinion, because although some crops will not get pollinated, that's one disadvantage. As the toxin may kill other insects, I've put a second within the crop, so there's no need to spray. Oh, I can see my internet isn't fab, so I'm just going to turn my camera off briefly. Okay, let's start that one again. So I would advise farmers to grow GM crops because although some crops will not get pollinated as the toxin may kill other insects, this is outweighed by the pesticide always being present within the crop, so there is no need to spray. This saves time for the farmer and produces a greater yield. So there I have given my opinion, and I've given at least 1, if not 2 or even 3 advantages and disadvantages. And I've done that in 2 sentences. 4 marks there. So you don't have to write lots to get the 4 marks at all. Questions? Okay, I'm going to leave that slide up because some of you might be writing that down. I'm going to pop to the Q&A quickly and look for any questions on there. I'll put my video back up as well. I think we're okay for the internet. Okay, lots of questions here. Right, so does A-level biology cover the same things as GCSE but in more depth? Yes, in general, and a couple of extra topics as well. It's really interesting, A-level biology. It goes into a bit more depth, and some of the stuff at GCSE that you just have to accept happens the way it happens. You'll get a bit more of an explanation for that. Is biomedical science, biomedical engineering, and bioscience similar? They are relatively similar. They just have different focuses on the area of biology. See? It's well worth looking into kind of the modules that are offered. If you're looking at university courses, look at the titles of the modules offered under those courses and work out which ones are most relevant to you. Couple of questions here. Should I include the question when writing the answer? That's a really good question. I always think that it's better to write in full sentences because then you can be exactly sure of what you're writing and the examiner knows that you've read the question properly. But if you're running short on time, it's worth writing the important bits. And for long answer questions, it is acceptable to bullet point your answers. I would still suggest that each bullet point should be accompanied by a short sentence rather than just a couple of words. But sometimes bullet pointing can help you to structure your answer. Another question about time management, struggling to finish tests in time. I think the secret there is to not write too much. Make sure that you read the questions and stay very calm. I know it's tricky, but the times are given for the times given are reasonable. So it's, if you keep reading your questions and keep going at a steady pace, you should be okay. Also, it's worth perhaps taking a quick flick through at the start, having a look at the number of questions there are, and then just thinking, okay, I've got 8 questions overall, so about halfway through the exam, I should be at about question 4. Okay. When are you going to talk about revision strategies? We'll do that in a sec when I've run through the rest of these. What was the last point for the 4 marker? Hopefully that's there now. Is this paper higher or foundation? These are a mix of questions. I tended to pick mostly foundation. Emailing the previous PowerPoint. So all of these sessions are available on the MyTutor YouTube account. So if you need to watch them back and get a good look at the slides, then that's fine. There's no problem there. You can do that on the MyTutor YouTube channel. So just pop that in your browser. That should be fine. How would you answer an evaluate question? You do that in evaluate and explain are kind of similar, but they're kind of different. So evaluate means you're evaluating your evidence. So you're really looking at the strengths and the weaknesses of the data that you're looking at. If a question says use information from the box and your own knowledge, but you don't know anything about that certain thing, will you lose marks? For example, I don't know what GM maze plans are, so I couldn't use my own knowledge for that. No, you might not know that, but you will know something about genetic engineering. So you'll always know something to do with the topic. And to be honest, for that question, you can mostly do it from the information in the box. What they're looking for from you is a bit more of an understanding of genetic engineering there. Best website to practice exams questions. I think that physics and maths tutor is the best one, and that is literally just type physics and maths tutor all in one word into your browser and it will come up, and then you can go to the GCSE Biology section and they've got revision notes and they've got questions by topic. That's the one that I tend to use. Bear in mind that the specification did change, so some of the questions might be a bit old. Some of the questions might include things that aren't on your specification. So a really good revision tip, because we were going to move on to just 2 minutes of those before we go, is to make sure you've got a copy of your specification. If that's AQA, OCR, WJEC, IGCSE, any of the others, make sure you've got a copy, because that has everything in it you need to know. If you can read through that and you know what most of it means, you're most of the way there. So don't be put off if some of the questions on physics and maths tutor have stuff that isn't on your spec, because between the changes in specifications and the different specifications available, you might find that some of them don't always cross over entirely. What are the most challenging topics in the higher tier AQA biology papers? To be honest, the one that we've done this term is one of the most challenging. Homeostasis tends to be a bit challenging as well. People get quite confused about the kidney and things that you have to learn about that and the heart. So it's worth kind of having a look at those. Those are the topics that I tend to get asked to tutor about mostly. Yeah, that's probably the 2 most difficult ones. People get quite intimidated by genetics, and it's not really intimidating. We've talked it through this half term in 5 hours, so you know it is these questions now to help. Okay, that's you're enjoying being school or college, and that's a lot. So oh, okay, so that's everything for today.